You all remember after Al died, Dave and Debbie and I cleaned out his house, which was a real labor of love, let me tell you. And in the process, I found a stack of sermons he had purchased years ago from a guy in Indiana named Reverend Bruce Clear. And I've kept the sermons, and every now and then I'm going to present one of them because I just think they're wonderful. And I thought this one in particular was so wonderful for today on there. As Americans, we have quite a few shared stories that help shape our identity. We know the stories of the Pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving. We know the stories of Honest Abe reading by candlelight and walking miles to return a borrowed book. Stories of Charles Lindbergh or Neil Armstrong, stories of Florence Nightingale and Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. All these stories get repeated, and in doing so, they help define who we are as a people. Some stories take on the cloak of myth, and the facts are not necessarily accurate, even if the meaning of the story is so. As Unitarians and Universalists, we also have stories that need to be told to help shape our identity. There is a story I have told of Michael Servetus, the 16th century Spanish theologian who was burned at the stake by John Calvin for questioning the doctrine of the Trinity. There is a story I've told of the Unitarian king in Transylvania during the Reformation by the name of John Sigismund, whose brief rule issued the first edict of religious freedom in the Western world. And of course the stories of the New England Transcendentalists, Emerson and Thoreau and so forth, are our stories and serve to inform our sense of identity. There is one Unitarian Universalist story that I believe is not told often enough. It is a relatively recent story, and one that we ought to be sure is passed down through new generations of Unitarians and Universalists. I'm always surprised when the story is told and received as new information to the UUs. This story should be at least as familiar to us as the Civil War stories of the Underground Railroad is as familiar to the Americans at large. The story I tell is the story of James Reeb, and that's R-E-E, B as in boy, not D as in dog, as I had on the website. And I found this picture of him that I will pass around. James Reeb is a Unitarian minister who was murdered and martyred in Selma, Alabama, during a civil rights demonstration in March 1965. It is a story of many dimensions, but it is one that I would hope might become a standard part of our Unitarian Universalist identity. The story begins in Selma years ago. The particular issue being addressed was the right of African Americans to vote. The landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, but it meant little unless it could be enforced and the rights could be protected. Throughout the South, blacks were denied the right to vote through literacy tests and other technical legal restrictions. That does have echoes of today. When that didn't work, outright intimidation was used. The previous year, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee led a voter registration drive in Selma, where only 156 of the 15,000 black residents showed up to vote, were on the voting rolls. In July, over 200 blacks showed up to register, and they were met by Sheriff Jim Clark's troops, who wielded cattle prods against them. The local judge issued an order forbidding blacks to gather in groups larger than 3. In some cases, the blacks who did register were better educated than the white registrars. One Selma resident, Amelia Platts Boynton, witnessed an incident during which a black teacher attempted to register, and the white registrar was having difficulty reading the questions to the teacher. The teacher finally said to the registrar, "Those words are constitutionality and interrogatory." The registrar turned red with anger, recalls Boynton. The teacher flunked the test and was refused her registration certificate. Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders decided it was time to challenge this part of the institutional discrimination and demand the right to vote. He and other civil rights leaders chose Selma, Alabama as the place to make their challenge, and demonstrations were planned for January 1965. Throughout the months of January and February, Selma was the site of endless demonstrations, mostly by local blacks. Various groups organized their own demonstrations: teachers, farmers, churches. There was even a demonstration by black beauticians and black undertakers. In each case, the demonstration was to demand the right to vote. In most cases, the demonstrators were met either by the violence of white mobs, or more often the violence of Sheriff Clark's nightstick and cattle prods. Hundreds were arrested and jailed. Martin Luther King was arrested on February 1st. In response, 500 of Selma's black school children marched to the courthouse, and they too were arrested. The next day, 300 more school children were arrested. The scene in Selma, Alabama was light years away culturally from Casper, Wyoming. James Reeb was born in 1927 in Wichita, Kansas, but his family moved to Wyoming when he was a teenager, and he always felt Wyoming to be his home, the place of his formative years. After graduating from Matrona County High School in Casper, he attended St. Olaf's College in Northfield, Minnesota.
Hold on one second, Kathy. I'll get this under control.
I'm sorry.
Theology reimagined.
Goodness.
The Osprey Foundation, the catalyst for empowered, healthy, and fulfilled lives.
He enlisted in the Army near the end of World War II, and after his service, he decided to train for the Presbyterian ministry. In 1950, he entered Princeton Theological Seminary, one of the finest Presbyterian schools. There was nothing particularly uncommon about his roots. A Western lad, he followed the trail of life through school, deciding to become a minister in an establishment church and trained for this vocation in a fine institution. Before he entered the seminary, he married a woman from back home in Casper. Her name was Marie Deacon. After leaving seminary, his first position was a chaplain in the Philadelphia General Hospital. I don't know if you were there, Randy. While there, he developed an interest in psychology and psychiatry, which also seems to have influenced him to begin to question his orthodox religious beliefs. From there, the story takes a turn that's familiar to many Unitarian Universalists. He struggled with his religious beliefs, as well as his religious vocation. After such struggle, he applied to transfer his ordination from the Presbyterians to the Unitarians. His transfer came not just from theological concerns. His devotion was to freedom, and the chains of creed found in other churches were for him too restrictive. In a letter he wrote to a friend in the Presbyterian ministry, he said, "In our time, when we are engaged in a desperate struggle with authoritarian societies determined to mold people's minds according to their own preconceived patterns, our society needs to strengthen the foundations upon which our democracy is built. When I remember the deep commitment of Protestant churches to our democratic way of life, it seems incongruous that the Presbyterian Church should still retain a practice so typical of those used by various authoritarian movements of our time." So when Reeb became restless to find a church that was anti-authoritarian, he found it among the Unitarians and eventually transferred his ordination.
Yay.
In 1959, he became the assistant minister at the All Souls Unitarian Church in Washington, D.C. What James Reeb had written, "Our society needs to strengthen the foundation upon which our democracy is built," was precisely what was happening in Selma, Alabama, in February of 1965, when more civil rights leaders trickled in to reinforce the demonstrations to demand voting rights for black citizens. On February 18th, one of Dr. King's associates, C.T. Vivian, went to Marion, Alabama, about 30 miles from Selma, where a similar voter registration drive was underway. He was to address an evening gathering at the Zion Chapel Methodist Church, located across from the courthouse, and from there they planned a night march and demonstration. The night marchers were met with unprecedented violence from police and white thugs. Charles Fager, who has written a book about the Selma March, told the story this way. The climax of the meeting was to be a night march. It wasn't going to be a long walk, just out the church and down the sidewalk, 100 yards or so in the direction of the jail. If they were stopped, the plan was to kneel for prayer, return to the church, and call it a night. But when the preachers at the head of the line came out the door, the sidewalk was lined with helmeted state troopers, long black billy clubs at the ready. "This is an unlawful assembly," the police chief announced over the public address system. "You are hereby ordered to disperse. Go home or go back to the church." Just then, all the street lights around the square went out, and the troopers began clubbing the Reverend James Doymes, a black minister at the front of the line. The panicked crowd tried to get back into the church, but the troopers came after them, clubs swinging, splitting scalps, and smashing ribs as they advanced. 2 or 3 dozen people rushed through the doors of Mac's Cafe a few doors down, seeking refuge in the crowded, dark interior. Among them were Jimmy Lee Jackson, a young man 26 years old, his mother, Viola Jackson, and his grandfather, Cager Lee, 82. The old man had already been caught and beaten behind the church and was bleeding. His grandson, Jimmy Lee, was helping him out the door to get medical attention when a squad of troopers came toward them, chasing and beating people before them, and forced the 2 men back into the cafe. The troopers came inside, smashed all the lights within reach, and began clubbing people indiscriminately. When one hit Viola Jackson and knocked her screaming to the floor, Jimmy Lee lunged at him. The trooper struck him across the face, and young Jackson went careening into the floor himself. Then a trooper picked him up and slammed him against a cigarette machine, while another trooper, a man named Fowler, drew his pistol and calmly shot him point blank in the stomach. Jimmy Lee Jackson would die in a hospital 7 days later. Governor George Wallace's response to the violence was as swift as it was uncompassionate. He issued an order banning all night demonstrations, saying, "Mass demonstrations in the nighttime, led by career and professional agitators with pro-communist affiliations and associations, is not in the interest of any citizen of this state, black or white." It was in the aftermath of the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson that the idea of a march from Selma to Montgomery was born. Montgomery was the state capital, home of Governor Wallace, and the people would take their demands directly to him. The governor vowed publicly that the march would not take place and began planning with state police to stop it. The march was to begin on Sunday. So far, in the dozens of marches in and around Selma, nearly all the participants were black, and the numbers were several hundred. The Sunday march was the same set as several hundred people began walking from Brown's Chapel until they came to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. At the bridge, they encountered state troopers, nearly 100 yards shoulder to shoulder across the highway's 4 lanes. The troopers had their billy clubs drawn. I will not detail the violence that followed, for as you can probably guess or remember, the troopers stormed the marches, beating them indiscriminately, men, women, children. One woman participant who was beaten later commented, "The horses were more humane than the troopers. They stepped over fallen victims." This became known as Bloody Sunday. There was no more march that day. The marchers were beaten, but they were not beaten in their cause. In response, Dr. King decided to call on churches and clergy from all over to join him in a new attempt to march from Selma to Montgomery. That night, he issued thousands of telegrams to church leaders across the country. And the telegram said, "In the vicious maltreatment of defenseless citizens of Selma, where old women and young children were gassed and clubbed at random, we have witnessed an eruption of the disease of racism which seeks to destroy all America. No American is without responsibility. The people of Selma will struggle on for the soul of the nation, but it is fitting that all Americans help bear the burden. I call, therefore, on clergy of all faiths to join me in Selma for a minister's march to Montgomery on Tuesday, March 9th. The All Souls Unitarian Church in Washington, D.C. is an unusual church, even among Unitarian churches, which by themselves are unusual enough. In the first place, it is one of our few fully integrated churches, with a congregation that is half white and half black. Over the years, it has been the church home of many important people, and even in James Reeb's time, it counted among its members U.S. senators, representatives, and even Supreme Court justices. In that environment, the young James Reeb flourished as the new assistant minister. He especially enjoyed the local social service projects that the church offered to improve its neighboring community. All Souls is very much an urban church in the heart of Washington, bordering both the prominent established area as well as nearby ghetto areas. His friend Ron Engel attributes James Reeb's love of democracy he learned in the Western culture. He said, "I don't think the easy democratic ways of Casper ever left him, and that is probably the reason why he could walk freely down the streets of any city and strike up a conversation with any passerby." Engel remembers Reeb once saying, "When I'm in the inner city, there is a sense in which I feel I'm still on the Wyoming prairie." References to James Reeb, back then and now, usually identify him as a minister at All Souls. He served All Souls for 5 years, but in fact, in September 1964, 6 months before Selma, he left All Souls to pursue a different kind of ministry. While All Souls was rewarding for him, he yearned to become more directly involved in the struggles of the inner city. He accepted an invitation to move to Boston to direct a low-income housing project in Roxbury, a poor black neighborhood. There he would be working for the American Friends Service Committee, and he jumped at the chance. In Washington, he and his wife and 4 children had lived in a comfortable parsonage in the exclusive suburban neighborhood of Chevy Chase. Now he moved his family to a deteriorated suburb of inner-city Boston, where the children would soon integrate the schools which had previously been exclusively black. 6 months on the job, on Sunday, March 7th, James Reeb, along with millions of other Americans, witnessed on television the brutal beating of peaceful protesters by the Alabama State Police at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. When he heard of Dr. King's invitation to clergy to come join a march on Tuesday, he responded and immediately made arrangements to go to Selma. When he arrived in Selma in time, he learned a federal judge had issued an injunction order against it, awaiting a hearing in the matter on Thursday. Dr. King was torn about what to do. He had no hesitation to stand up to state judges, but federal judges so far had been allies. On Tuesday, with their numbers swelled in response to the invitation to clergy, thousands of marchers, with clergy at the front lines, headed once again to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where once again they faced an armed column of state police. Dr. King knelt in prayer and then asked the marchers to turn back and await the ruling of the judge. This delay was unexpected. Most marchers from out of town had planned to march on Tuesday and then return home, and in fact many of them did. Reeb almost did. In his book about Selma, Fager tells it this way: "As the march broke up, many of those who had come from a distance to join it headed back to Montgomery or piled into their cars for the long drive home. One of those doing so was the Reverend James Reeb. Reeb had lived in a ghetto with his family, and his decision to fly down and join the march was predictable. He had driven from Atlanta with several other Unitarian ministers, and now prepared to accept a ride back to Atlanta with a woman named Jean Levine. He threw a suitcase in the back of Mrs. Levine's car, but just then fell into a conversation with another Unitarian minister who was planning to stay over to be available for any other needed witness. Reeb was reluctant to leave Selma after such a brief stay, and agreed with his colleague that the city's blacks were not yet out of the woods. He retrieved his suitcase and joined a group of about a dozen other Unitarian ministers that were headed downtown to get some supper at a black restaurant, Walker's Cafe on Washington Street. Walker's Cafe is a small establishment serving strictly Alabama soul food: fried chicken, collard greens, big wedges of cornbread and sweet potato pie. The place was packed with marchers, and Reeb had to wait for a table along with 2 of his fellow Unitarian ministers, Clark Olson of Berkeley and Orloff Miller, also of Boston. They lingered over the rich, pungent food, which was easy to do, and just before they left, Reeb called his wife Marie to tell her he was staying in Selma one more day. He says, I will not detail here the vicious murder that followed. The gist is simply that when they left Walker's Cafe, they were attacked by 4 club-wielding white racists. Reeb received the severest blow, fell into a coma that night, and died 2 days later on March 11th. According to Olaf Minister, one of the other ministers beaten, because of the attack, that day was called Turnaround Day. He observes the irony that it took the death of a white minister before the country would finally take notice. There was no overwhelming outcry at the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson the month before, but there certainly was now. So there is sad irony in that. Marie Reeb received telegrams from senators and religious leaders and even President Johnson. In fact, the president sent Air Force One to transport her back to Boston after she went to visit Jim in the hospital. At his official funeral in Boston, at the Arlington Street Church, the historic Unitarian church that was the site of many abolitionist meetings in the last century, 25,000 people gathered outside to pay their respects. Perhaps even more importantly, within a few days of Reeb's death, Congress was considering a newly prepared Voting Rights Act to ensure the rights for all citizens. The president presented it with a televised speech in which he compared the events in Selma with Lexington and Concord during the American Revolution. The family of Jimmy Lee Jackson, however, received no such notable sympathy. Be that as it may, the turnaround happened. In Dr. King's previous request for clergy to join him, hundreds responded. Now, in the aftermath of Reeb's death, thousands more flocked to Selma for a new march. By coincidence, the Board of Trustees of the UUA was meeting in Boston at the time of Reeb's death. When they heard the news, and then heard the plans for the march were still on, the board adjourned its meeting and then reconvened the next day in Selma, so that board meetings could participate in the upcoming march. More than 100 Unitarian ministers arrived in Selma over the next few days, and on Monday, when another march was attempted, James Reeb's memory was honored by placing a contingent of Unitarian ministers toward the front. Dana Greeley, the president of the UUA, was in the front line. The Great March, however, had to wait for clearance from the federal court. That finally came 10 days later. And on March 21st, 8,000 people left Brown's Chapel in Selma, crossing over the Edmund Pettus Bridge under the protection of 1,800 National Guard, 2,000 Army troops, 100 FBI agents, and another 100 federal marshals, all ordered by President Johnson. The walk to Montgomery took 5 days, and the marchers slept in tents along the way. In that final leg of the march, entering into Montgomery, the number of marchers reached over 25,000. And when they reached the Capitol building, they retreated to the uplifting words of Dr. King at his most eloquent. Governor Wallace did not meet with them, but he could be seen peeking out from behind the Venetian blinds in the state Capitol building. Within a few months, the Voting Act of 1965 was overwhelmingly passed by Congress. Some may wonder what happened to the 4 men who murdered James Reeb. The story is not too surprising. 3 were arrested and acquitted. The 4th fled into Mississippi and was never extradited back. Those who killed James Reeb were not in the end brought to final justice. Sad as that is, there is something at least symbolically fitting about getting away with murder, for justice is still not won. The civil rights movement was fairly successful in ridding our society of most of the legal and institutional forms of racism. But justice is still not won and will not be won as long as racism continues as an acceptable attitude in society. There is a danger in some successes, for there remains an illusion that racism is over. The danger is that the resulting apathy toward injustice that now continues to be part of this country. The Voting Rights Act was finally passed, and in that sense, the Selma March, and James Reeb's sacrifice was effective. The leaders of racism in this country, George Wallace and Sheriff Jim Clark, are today widely perceived as what they were, bigots. Selma was a success, and our country ought to celebrate its achievements. In the epilogue to his book on Selma, Charles Fager writes, "There have been too few Selmas in our time. We must not let them slip from our memory." To me, I would add, we cannot afford, as Unitarian Universalists, to let James Reeb slip from our memory either. That is our responsibility as Unitarian Universalists. This was in 2001. He says the UUA headquarters was raising private funds to construct a memorial to James Reeb. And I forgot to look and see if they did that. The project is being organized by a committee of 9 Unitarian Universalists who were particularly active in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Finally, I want to say a word about Reeb's religious motivation. In our Unitarian Universalist circles, there are some who, based on personal experience, are suspicious of religious motivations. I can understand some of that feeling. And yet, one cannot write the heroic story of the civil rights movement without highlighting the pivotal role of the churches and church leaders and those who entered the fray out of deeply religious conviction. There were hundreds of clergy who at a moment's notice would leave their homes to join a march that had already seen violence and that was guaranteed to be dangerous. They did so from religious conviction. They represented the entire spectrum of our religious community, Catholic, Protestant, and Jew. Duncan Hallett was the senior minister with James Reeb at All Souls Church in Washington, D.C. In a sermon delivered commemorating the 25th anniversary of Reeb's death, Hallett spoke about Reeb's deep convictions. That's what took him to Selma, the kind of person he was. That was why he joined the others of his fellow ministers who went to Selma in response to the nationwide call for help by Martin Luther King. James Reeb really cared for his fellow human creatures. That was the nub of it. He cared for them all, great and small, famous and unknown, black and white, rich and poor, powerful and weak. And that concern, that caring, that love took him into a black restaurant following the march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, even though he knew how risky it was. But he could do nothing else. Were he with us today and heard us talking as we are, he would be the first to say that there is no reason to single him out. What happened to him could as well have happened to any of the white marchers who ate at the restaurant that night. And we would have to agree. What happened to Jim might have happened to any of the civil rights marchers, but it did happen to Jim. And we who knew him knew why he was there, where he could be the one who was struck down by white racists outside a Selma restaurant. It happened to Jim because of what he was, because of what he believed. In his last sermon at All Souls Church in Washington, he had asked rhetorically, "How far does one go in the struggle for justice?" His answer had been clear and unequivocal. How far does one go? All the way.
Very, very good. Oh, boy. What a preacher he